Um, so, what does perfectionism have to do with ADHD? Well, let's think for a minute about what is perfectionism. So, some common traits of perfectionists: we're self critical, all or nothing thinking. If it's not completely right, then it might be a failure. We're often driven by fear. We're afraid of disappointing ourselves or others, or negativity or judgment, particularly from outsiders, people outside of ourselves. There's we Perfectionists often set unreasonable standards for themselves, and you may, as someone with ADHD, compare yourself to neurotypical peers. How Or your kids may do this as well. How come they can do X, Y, and Z and I cannot? Perfectionists often over focus on the end results, not the process of getting there or the learning that's happening, but the accomplishment. Am I doing the accomplishment or not? There's an avoidance of failure or perception of failure without that accomplishment. There's also sensitivity to feedback, sometimes defensiveness. There can be rigidity and discouragement or depression because of incomplete goals, particularly when those goals are set in contrast to for yourself, based on what other people are doing. And then there is low self-worth. So what does perfectionism have to do with ADHD? So, there are, as we know, there are different kinds of procrastination that go along with having ADHD. And I believe that one of the most common ones is perfectionism procrastination, being immobilized by worry about messing up. So I'm not going to get started. If I can't get this just right, why bother? Jasmine, age 12, says, sometimes I have a fit if things aren't right. I want to do everything right, like with the trumpet. I want it to sound good, really good, but it gets too hard. I like to play rock songs, but those are harder. I'll try, I'll quit, I'll try again, get more annoyed, and then I give up. Does this sound familiar to you? So, just as a little aside here, there are three types of procrastination. There's perfectionism procrastination, because perfectionism is related to procrastination. Perfectionism procrastination is an attempt to limit mistakes and reduce future shame. I'm not going to get started on this because I don't know if I can do it perfectly or super well. So instead, I'm going to avoid doing it. There's also avoidance procrastination, which is related to a fear of failure or an expectation of failure based on past experience. I'm going to avoid doing this thing that isn't so fun for me because in the past I haven't succeeded. Why do I think I'm going to succeed now? In some cases. In other cases, I'm going to avoid trying this thing because I can't stand doing it. I don't know how to get started. And, I'm afraid of how it's going to turn out. And then productive procrastination, which we've talked about before, is my favorite, which is a delay tactic that feels really good. I'm going to do these other things that I know I can do pretty well, but I'm not going to try that big thing because I don't know if I'm going to do it well enough, or if I know how to approach this problem, but I'm going to feel like I'm getting things done. So there's short-term relief. So when we're talking about perfectionism, and to some degree, the different kinds of procrastination, we're looking at underlying issues of shame and low self confidence. I don't know if I can get this right. I don't know if I'll be able to meet the standards that I'm setting for myself that are in comparison to neurotypicals. I don't know if I am going to set the standards or the goals that people are setting for me. I haven't had, super good a good track record in this area. So, perfectionism is a way that we try to control our outcome, and it is directly related to anxiety, which we know travels very frequently with ADHD. I was doing a workshop with someone last night on twice exceptional kids and adults and anxiety. And we were talking about how the rates of documented anxiety for ADHD are so much lower than what we believe people experience in person. And so we when I think about perfectionism, I do think about anxiety. And I have shared here that anxiety is one of my close friends. So perfectionism goes along with that. And I think perfectionism also comes up because if you're capable in some areas, then you expect yourself to be capable in a lot of other areas. And when you're not, you push yourself or you judge yourself because you can't meet the standards that you can in other ways. And then you start to really hate on yourself, which is what we want to avoid. So I see lots of comments. I'm going to go backwards. And let's see. Susan says, in California, how can I be a perfectionist when I'm anything but? I think I explained that. Hi, Kelly from Columbus, Ohio. And Heather, Lynn, does this have to do with not starting projects? Absolutely. Because we don't start things if we don't know we can't finish them. And so what happens is because we live in a very goal-oriented world where we have to do something, complete it, and move on to the next thing, we sometimes lose the joy of actually the process, right? Am I going to bake a cake that's delicious and beautifully decorated because that's what's important, how it's going to look? Or am I going to focus on the delicious part? And if it's slumping on one side, is that okay? Heather, OCD is certainly somewhat related to perfectionism. Patrick, you call yourself a failed perfectionist. I would love to hear why. That sounds a little like you're being a little tough on yourself. Maribel says, that's me, my mom, and my son. Um, let's see. Julianne, you're describing my first 35 years. Definitely a perfectionist. By 35, I started working on being a recovering perfectionist. Ooh, I love that. A recovering perfectionist. I may use that. I think that's fantastic. I would say I am in the same boat, learning how to recover from perfectionism. Peter, is ADHD a genetic thing? I have so much difficulty in life because of this, but I still try to get by. Yes, good for you for continuing to get by. We all are trying to get by, whether we have ADHD or not. And ADHD is a biologically based condition that is the most highly inherited mental health condition. If you have ADHD, there's an over 50% chance, 50 to 57%, depending which study you're looking at, that one of your parents, your biological parents, had ADHD as well, or it runs in the family. Renee, I was always told that my perfectionism is related to anxiety. How can you determine where it's from, anxiety or ADHD? So I think that uh, you know, um, it's probably from both. Because what I've talked about before is that a lot of people with ADHD have anxiety because there have been times in the past where you've struggled or you've messed up and you didn't even know you were doing something that wasn't okay to be doing. And so this develops into a kind of persistent level of worry, of vigilance. When is the next time I'm going to be going along my merry way and get feedback that that wasn't okay? And so this does build anxiety in people with ADHD, and that can then feed perfectionism. I'm going to try really hard to get everything right so I don't make a mistake, get that negative feedback, feel embarrassed, etc. Paula asks, can you have perfectionism without anxiety? Yes, in the way that there is no worry or fear, but just the love of achieving. Yes, of course, people can have perfectionism in the absence of anxiety. Um, they may enjoy that idea, the achievement that they get, the positive feedback they get when they achieve. Um, so those are traits that go along with perfectionism. It is, however, driven by anxiety for other people. It may not be driven that way. It may not be that way for you, excuse me. Heather, both my son have ADD and ADHD. It's difficult. It can be very difficult when a parent and a child has ADHD. And since this is a very common scenario, it's important for you as parents to look at your own ADHD and learn how to manage that in conjunction with your kids. In fact, it can be really helpful for kids when you model, oh, I'm going to work on this. You're working on this, or here's something you've asked me to change to do less of, and here's something I'd like you to do more of. So we're both working on something together. Kristen, I tend to ask a lot of questions with my assignments and tasks because I'm afraid of doing something wrong. Yes, so a lot of times people with ADHD do that. One of my clients this week said that, and he's in high school, he's 16. He said that he, wrote a draft of his English paper and he brought it in early to show it to his English teacher to say, is this what you're looking for? And the teacher said, I don't review papers before they're turned in. And he turned the paper in, and then he failed English for the fall. And this whole thing made me so angry, and it of course aggravated the parents, particularly because this child has an IEP. So there should be extended effort being made to support him, and he struggles with written expression and reading. Sarah Jane asks, how do we work past perfectionism taking over? Excellent question. I'm a business owner and often delay sending invoices for fear of not being perfect. I have also received some very tough anonymous letters recently that have knocked me back. Okay, so what we want to think about here is that we know, because we've talked about it, that people with ADHD can be very sensitive to negative feedback. We take it in, we mull over it, we stew, we hold on to it for a long time. And other people who maybe don't have ADHD or are less sensitive can take in the feedback and say and sort of piece out, this I want to hold on to, this makes sense, this doesn't, and it's not personalized. And one of the things that I think I want to, just suggest is what Al-Anon teaches, which is Q-tip, quit taking it personally. When someone gives you feedback, take what you think it makes sense and take and then, perhaps the delivery isn't very kind or some of it doesn't really ring true for you. That's okay. Take the piece that makes sense. So if people are giving you feedback about it, um, some of that has to do with them, and some of it might be something you can learn from because that's our purpose, right? We're living and we're learning. We're trying to improve ourselves. So if you delay sending invoices because they're not perfect, ultimately that's going to hurt you. Maybe you need to have someone to check your invoices or hire someone to help you to take care of that if it's really holding you back. On the other hand, you could make sure you get a computer program, whether it's QuickBooks or something that sort of speeds this along and may be able to check for any errors. Um, Marcia says ODD is the absolute devil. Thank you. Veronica, how can a person's perfectionism be tackled if they have very little self-compassion? That is a fantastic question. How do we build self-compassion in light of perfectionism, in light of these unreasonable standards you might be setting for yourself by comparing yourself to peers or people in your neighborhood who drive fancier cars or have bigger houses or earn more money? So, what we want to do is start with what it is about ourselves that we think we actually do okay, even well. When you can hold on to what it is that you do pretty well, you do okay enough. I want you to write those down on a post-it and put it on your refrigerator, put it on your bathroom mirror, and so you can have some affirmations. I like when I think I do an okay job at. Because right now, what's happening is the negative self talk is outweighing acknowledgement of the ways in which you are just uniquely you. And that's wonderful. Um, So, another way that you can build self compassion is to consider keeping a list at the end of each day, a little journal, or you can keep it on your phone, of three things that went well, three things that you liked about your day, or something that you did. And it might be really small. I made an excellent cup of coffee, or I liked how I spoke in the work meeting, or I really had a good phone call where I showed up for a friend. Doesn't have to be major things. One day this last week, I was having a tough time, and one of the things for me was I liked the outfit that I wore. So, we don't have to always be at the top, right? We want to acknowledge those small things because that's what's going to feed us. Patrick says, I say failed perfectionist because I want what I do to be perfect, but I end up saying, oh, well, it's not going to be perfect. I just have to knuckle down and get it done. I have to let the idea of perfection go or I get stuck in a loop. Thank you for saying that, Patrick, because I think that's really important. That has to do with, what our expectations are for ourselves and how we're setting those. So we don't want to set expectations that are really, low or feel like, well, we don't have to work. Sometimes we want to have things that are just come easy. And sometimes we want to have things that are a little more challenging. But we don't want to have too many expectations that are way up here that we cannot reach. Because then we're going to feel like we're never actually getting to where we want to go. And part of being a recovering perfectionist is to set and to set goals that you can actually reach and to acknowledge how you're getting there and when you get there. Jennifer, I helped my 8-year-old work on her GT project this week. She glued one of the pictures on the wrong color paper based on where she was going to glue it on her board. She didn't like it, not perfect, so she had me print it again so she could make it match. LOL. I would have done the same thing as a kid and as an adult. So, there are different kinds of perfectionism that affect us in different ways. That isn't so terrible. She had a particular idea of how she wanted it to look, and it wasn't a major issue to print it out and do it again. And there are other times where we can let something go. Last night my husband made some special cookies for the Jewish holiday of Purim, and they just didn't come out very well. And he decided not to. I don't know if he decided to take them to work or not because by the time I woke up, he was gone. But it was interesting because he reflected back to me. I said, "Well, you can just take them; they taste good." And he reflected back to me, "When you cook for other people, you like it to be just so. So do I." And I realized that that's true. Like if I cook something and it doesn't come out exactly right and I'm serving it to other people, I talk about it with other people. Like I say, oh, I wish I had done a better job, or I'm sorry this isn't so great. I go overboard. And I think that that's really something that a lot of perfectionists do. We kind of apologize for the ways in which we're not perfect. No one really cares as much as we do. So it's worth saying, like, well, I gave it my best shot. It's not perfect, but it'll do. And that's really hard to do, particularly for people with ADHD, because you're concerned about the negative backlash you're going to get if it's not just so. Chantel, do you think children who deal with extreme anger outbursts will grow out of them if surrounded by a family who isn't like that? Well, Chantel, what I would want to say is maybe, but I think when kids have extreme anger or outbursts, what they're showing you is that they do not have the skills to manage in a particular situation in a given set of circumstances, so they need to learn those skills. Rebecca, hi. Um, D's teachers told me he has to get things perfect like his writing. Right. So how can we assist kids who, won't do things because they're not perfect or get very upset with themselves if they can't do it perfectly or criticize themselves along the way and get upset because they're having a hard time and they can't get it the way they ideally think it should go. So what we want to try to do is to break tasks down into smaller chunks so kids can try something smaller and feel that they're on their way, that there's a sense of success. But we also want to teach our kids about growth mindsets. because growth mindsets are the opposite of perfectionism. A growth mindset says, I'm going to try something. If it doesn't work out, I'm going to regroup, I'm going to listen to the feedback, and I'm going to try something again. With writing, that's very difficult for a lot of kids with ADHD because they struggle to get their ideas from here onto the paper. And that process of struggling with written expression holds them back. And so we're dealing with the frustration that they can't take their ideas and get them on paper or organize them in a particular kind of way. And I've talked a while ago about how writing uses all 11 of your executive functioning skills. And so it's very frustrating for people with ADHD who have, you know, several executive functioning skill challenges simultaneously. Charlie says perfectionism impacts other people too. My mother was a perfectionist, and it was quite stressful living with a perfectionist growing up. Now I suffer in the sense that I both want to be in control of things and I want to be perfect at things, but I also lack the motivation to be a perfectionist. This leads me with anxiety. I hear you. I think one of the things that happens with perfectionism is this idea that that we're in control of avoiding failure. You know, things are our responsibility. And sometimes things happen that are not our responsibility that we can, account for. And sometimes they are. And so it's important for us to kind of gauge, when actually do I have a sense of control over this and it makes sense that I'm going to put my effort into it, and when sometimes things just don't work out. I'm trying a new recipe, I've never made it before. It's kind of like going through life, right? I'm trying this recipe, I follow it, I taste it, not exactly what I hoped for. Good to know. Maybe I won't make it again. Maybe I'll try to tweak it before I serve it. So we want to think about that, because one of the issues when you are raised by a perfectionist, they export their standards of getting everything right onto you. And now you want to get everything right, not just to please them, because that's what kids do with their parents, but because that's what you believe is expected of you when you operate in the world. Heather, I have anxiety and depression and was brought up being told I had learning disabilities, but realized it was ADD. But it wasn't big in the late 60s, early 70s. That's correct, Heather. That was true for my brother. He clearly had uh, um, ADHD, but it wasn't treated particularly well in the 70s or effectively. And, it was mostly about anxiety for him. And he didn't figure it out until he was quite a bit older when his son was diagnosed. Peter, for me, I could do everything except one task correct, and that one thing will destroy whatever positivity I got. Ouch. My parents growing up would never give praise for doing good things, grades, sports. So for me, anything less than being perfect is useless. So, Peter, here's what I want to say to you. You have internalized this voice that anything less than perfect is useless. And what I would like you to actively do is come up with a phrase to say to that voice, because that voice is not your voice. That's that imported parental voice. And you, as a grown up, have control on the knob of the volume and frequency of that voice. What is it that you could say to that voice instead of anything less than perfect is useless? How about something such as anything less than perfect is normal? Anything less than perfect means I'm trying, I'm efforting. That's what's important. Stefan, how do you personally work around justifying perfectionism? Um, how do I personally work with justifying perfectionism? I think that I understand perfectionism from the inside out, and justifying perfectionism is that sometimes perfectionism can be very motivating, just like productive worry. It's the good part of perfectionism. I want to do well. I am putting efforts in. I'm getting resources. I want it to look nice, just like the little girl who had an idea of what picture went on what color page. I have my own sense of how things should look and work. That's fantastic. And so I think that that's something that you want to hold on to. What you don't want to hold on to is the rigidity associated if it doesn't turn out just the way you wanted. That idea that Peter said, if it's not exactly the way I thought it should be in my head, it's useless, it's worthless. That diminishes all of your efforts, and it also diminishes the value of your efforts and the process you're engaged in. Heather, that angers me. I would have fought if that happened to my son. Well, yes, the parents are fighting. I assume you're talking about my client, and there's an IEP coming up. Let's see. This is good information. Thank you. How do you correct your child with ADHD so they don't get sensitive? Or this is a terrific question because how do we deal with perfectionist people in our lives? Because a lot of perfectionists are defensive because of the internalized negativity. If it's not perfect, it's not worth anything. So what we want to do is we want to always lead with what you see and you observe in terms of effort and positive output. And then you want to ask, how do you feel about this? What do you like about it? And what would you have liked to see be different? We want to try to shift the idea of negative feedback. One client I worked with said, I don't know why you adults think there's such a thing as positive feedback. It's all negative, it's all bad. That's what we want to try to avoid. Remember that kids with ADHD are very sensitive to hearing about how they're not measuring up. So we want to basically acknowledge what you see them doing. That's when they're doing it, things that you're excited about, you've asked them to do, that celebration of my 5 C's. And then when they're not doing something, be judicious about what that is. People can really only change one thing at a time. So if you're criticizing your kids for 5, 6, or 7 things, they are going to be sensitive. Come together with your kids, talk about what's something that they'd like to change about themselves. What's something, and I would bet you $100 that what's on their list is on your list. Go with that and work with them on that and give feedback in that area predominantly and give it kindly. I notice, I observe. How could you change it? If you were rewinding, what would you rewind and do? How would you do it differently? Heather says, sometimes I can let it go and sometimes I can't. Of course. Well, we all can. Sometimes we take in people's feedback, and it's hard to get it out of our head. It's hard to feel like, gosh, I wish they hadn't said that because now it's running its own little tape. But we can press the pause button when people say things that hurt us, it's 50% about us and 50% about them. They can say it in a different way. They can they can sort of have a little more compassion. Maybe they're triggered about something. So we want to really take that into account when for about practicing forgiveness, because letting go is not just about letting go, it's about practicing forgiveness. One of the challenges with letting it go, at least for me, has always been, if I let it go, what am I going to hold on to? So if you're letting something go, whether it's a goal that you had, a hope, um, some way that someone hurt you, what are you going to replace that holding on with? What are you going to say or do instead? Dara, my ADHD son is going through puberty, 15 years old in May, and is really seeking more independence. Problem is, he is still mentally immature by 2 to 3 years. Welcome to the club. That's very true for a lot of kids with ADHD. Anytime we try and give more freedom, we give an inch and he takes a mile. It's causing friction, and it's been a struggle trying to compromise appropriately. So here's the thing. He wants independence, but he has to earn it, right? He has to show you that he's ready for the independence that you're giving him. And if you're giving him independence and he's not showing up in the way that he needs to, he's not following through, then he's actually consistently, okay? Occasionally we expect, but regularly over and over. You say you can stay out until 11, he comes home at 12. What's the logical consequence for that? The next time he goes out, he can stay out until 10:30 because he hasn't actually cooperated with the agreement that you made. So you want to set agreements that he can cooperate with, and you want him to show you with his actions and behavior that he's doing what you're asking, and then you can, go up a notch if you want to, or, open more things up. Maribel, how do I minimize the anxiety when you don't get the result you expected, and how to learn how to enjoy the small achievements? That's a really great question because when we don't get what we're hoping for, what we get is disappointed. And anxiety is a coping mechanism for tolerating disappointment. None of us come into the world with a very strong, buff six pack of our disappointment muscle. We have to develop this over time. And the way we develop a disappointment muscle is by experiencing disappointment. And we've all been there, right? That's how we've matured and it's how we've learned as adults. So what happens is that we become anxious because we're afraid of disappointing others or being disappointed ourselves. We're not comfortable in that scenario. And so we have to figure out how to support ourselves in that discomfort, how to stand in it, and how to support our kids. This is how kids learn resilience. It's how you learn resilience. Things are disappointing, and what am I going to do? How am I going to hold it? What's going to help me move through it? I think learning to enjoy the small achievements is a challenge for a perfectionist, particularly um, people who set high goals for themselves, because if it's not this, then it's actually not anything. And we need to look at those steps we're making. What are some goals we've had for ourselves? And when we get there, to remember to take it in, breathe, take a walk, congratulate yourself. It's okay to feel good in your accomplishment. Tomorrow is another day. Something may happen that might bring you down a notch. But right now, look at what you did that worked and enjoy it. Julianne, I'm a recovering perfectionist. I think we need a club for all of us recovering perfectionists. I'm working on my work projects being good enough. High five to you. Um, I generally spend too much time on work assignments that I got to a point where I had to talk myself about how much energy I spent on it. This is excellent, Julianne. I'm very, very happy for you because a lot of time, particularly for people with ADHD, their efforts well exceed what's demanded of them in a particular situation or project because they want to make sure it's just so, and you get burned out. So you want to be able to look at what is good enough. Good enough is good enough. I trained in psychodrama many years ago, and I worked with this wonderful woman, Dorothy Satin, and she used to say, um, real is better than perfect. And I love this. I love this expression. And I say it to myself, in those moments when I'm striving for perfection or it's not good enough. I think about Dorothy and I say, real is better than perfect because that's who we all are. Nobody is perfect. And if you think someone's perfect, then you're comparing your insides to their outsides, which may look a way that's very different from what they experience internally. Andrea, um, I don't know if it's perfectionism or just knowing my limits, maybe, or both, but I'm 36 and don't have my driver's license. I started learning in my 20s, even got a permit, but at the time I wasn't doing it because I was ready, because others thought it was time to learn this. I wasn't mentally stable at all, and my family member who was giving me lessons was too reactive in a negative way, and it resulted in crying meltdowns for me. Now, I've done a lot of self work, but I'm still afraid of this, thinking I can't do it. I can't learn because of my ADHD, hypoactive, and inattentive nature. So, what I want to say is you can do this. Many, many people with ADHD learn how to drive, and you can too. Start small. Take a lesson that's 15 minutes, then 30 minutes, then maybe an hour. I don't know how long driver's lessons are, but you want to start very small. And and we call this, we're dealing with anxiety sometimes, exposure therapy. Maybe for you, the first part is just sitting in the car and turning it on. Maybe that's enough. Maybe sitting in the car and turning it on with another person and then, slowly um, going 25 feet. Start small and work in increments. Anna, OMG, don't take it personally is a great idea, but so freaking difficult. I know, right? I know. That's why I actually have right here on my computer a post-it that says Q-tip, quit taking it personally, just in case I need a reminder. Lynn says, what is ODD? ODD is oppositional defiance disorder. Storm, Maribel, I found some advice for that. I found that setting a goal roadmap helps. What a great idea. That's terrific. Sure, you don't have the skills to do it just yet, but if you complete easier related goals, you'll train those skills in the process. I love that. I think that's fantastic. Anyone else have a goal roadmap? A goal roadmap. Um, let's see. Let's see who else I've got here. Andrea, once I learned that your 100% isn't the same as your 100% yesterday. Your 100% today may have been like your 60% yesterday. That's great. So you're giving yourself some leeway. And that's one of the things that perfectionists need the most is leeway. Some days go better than others. It doesn't mean you're a failure. Jessica, my daughter's ADD seems to have gotten a lot worse since the epidemic. Could this be due to the disruption of her schedule? Probably 100%. It's very hard right now for kids who have lost their routines related to school and life. Shella Ann, what about expectations in relationships? Is that a thing? Once I see the parts I don't like and can't handle, I'm starting to walk away. Well, this is interesting. I think that expectations in relationships can be very helpful. The question is, are you having unrealistic expectations? Because whoever your partner is also human. We are all human. We all, you know, we all have our strengths and our challenges. We have our beautiful aspects of our personalities, and we have some warts. So I think the question is, what are some challenges or some character traits in your partners that may not be ideal, but they're willing to work on because they love you, and you're willing to work on some of the ones in you for them because you care about them. I've noticed that too. I only started work on this year. Okay. Um, Sometimes we set unrealistic expectations of our partners. And again, that's that exporting pattern. We want them to be a particular way because then we will feel better about that. But we're judging them. And yet we don't want to be judged by them, even though we open the door for that every time we judge them. Veronica, what can you do if you do reach your perfect product? Oh, thumbs up on that. But because of that, live in a constant state of exhaustion. Thumbs down on that. Okay. Perfectionism shouldn't be the price of your sanity. And I do struggle with this. I definitely am an overachiever. I say yes to a lot of things, and I'm actively working on trying to say no more often so I have more time to, walk and be outside and knit a sweater or whatever I want to do or watch a movie on a Saturday afternoon. So I think what we have to do is to look at our limits. We are human. We have energetic limits as well as intellectual limits and physical limits. So instead of, pushing yourself so that you're exhausted, step back for a minute and say, okay, where is this thing where I am not willing to change my standard? And where is this thing where I could alter my standard a bit more so that I feel a little more relaxed? Heather, I wish I knew about this sooner. It has brought so much pain. It's good to know now because it can be different going forward. I agree. I'm so glad you're here. For me, I didn't learn. I couldn't continue with the exhaustion and had to let some of my perfection go. Yes, our health and our well-being is very important. Carolina, how do I help my son who beats himself up when things go wrong? I praise his efforts a lot, but when he's crying, it hurts me. Yes, there's nothing worse than that. Honestly, when your kids are so hard on themselves and they're crying about, you know, various ways in which they can't stand themselves or what they're doing. I think the important thing is that when your kids are sad is to be with them in that sadness. To say, I know this is hard. I'm here for you. You're not alone. We can talk about the facts or all the have tos and the want tos later, but in this moment, you're feeling bad. I love you, and you are more than this particular thing that's dragging you down, even though it doesn't feel that way right now. Patrick, writing is such an important part of our lives. My son struggles with written output, and I do as well. I think that's part of the perfection loop. I agree, Patrick. I don't want to write it because I don't want to write it incorrectly. I promote the idea of just getting something out on paper, and that seems to help break the perfection block. That is absolutely the way to go. What I encourage people who struggle with perfectionism with writing is to do two things. One, dictate, just talk out what's in your head, and then you can look at it and edit it later. Or two, write from what I call the right side of the brain. You just put your fingers on the keys and you just start writing whatever ideas are in your head. The idea is that you create a kind of flow where you're translating what's in your head onto the paper. Dana, record your thoughts on your phone or recorder so you can go back and listen to them and write them down at your own pace. Yes, that's a great idea. Thank you. Harlan, I need to work on that, on jettisoning that voice of that perfection is the minimum. Rational emotive therapy has particularly helped me with this. Thanks, Harlan. Bex Barber, not the greatest thing to feel and read to be responsible for. Lots of praising, yes. One of my classes mentioned a method of positive feedback where you lead and end with a compliment. Right. So that can be very helpful. What you want to avoid is there are people who teach this. I'm not a super fan of it. It's like the hamburger model where you have like the positive comment and then something negative and then the positive comment underneath. What is our brain going to like latch onto is that negative comment. So we want to think about actually how we want to say something that is giving feedback, and yes, we want to attach it to the positive, but we want to try to say it in a way that the person can hear. Statements like don't, stop, um, you shouldn't. These are things that aren't actually necessarily going to help someone change. You might want to reframe it as a question. What about trying this? This isn't what we agreed to. Or, hey, we talked about doing this. Let's try it a different way. Harlan says, in my classes, even if material uses the word positive criticism, I replace it with a rewording of feedback or what someone else might want to share with you. Very nice. Thank you. Stefan, do you find parents reluctant to invest themselves in their kids' diagnosis because they didn't get recognition as kids themselves with ADHD or didn't get support from their own parents? Yes, sometimes I do. Some parents who are like this, basically, their position is, I managed. I didn't have a diagnosis. You can do the same. And that's really a very limited and unhelpful perspective, because you may have managed because people didn't believe it or people didn't understand ADHD at the time, but now we do. And we want to give our kids every opportunity that's possible. Oh, it's almost time to stop. Donnified Irish, how can you commit to giving a positive affirmation when the ADHD pubescent preen is a creative extremist in being oppositional for every task, including um, virtual learning for school? So that's a really good question. What we want to try to do is find something that your creative extremist actually enjoys doing and to grow that so we can um, pay attention and nurture the one or two things that they enjoy doing. And then sit down with your creative extremist team and say, hey, what do you think is going well? What might need some tweaking? And then you can say, here's what I think is going well, and here's what I think needs some tweaking. And then when there's got to be some overlap between what the two of you think, pick something that's on her list and work on that. And then talk about what do reminders look like? What does redirection look like? How can I let you know when you're off track? Um, so that you can hear what she has to say and incorporate some of those suggestions. Not all, because she's not running the show. You are the adult, you are running the show into how you talk to her. And I'll take two more and then we're going to stop at 4:50 my time. Patrick, that sensitivity to criticism is interesting. It's something I've been living with 30 plus years of undiagnosed ADHD. My 14-year-old is also sensitive to criticism. I thought for me that it was because of my schooling, but my son experiences it too, and he has been raised in a very ADHD positive environment. Yeah, so that has to do with some of the wiring and the sensitivity and just living with ADHD. Storm, this is a good suggestion. Why not complement what they've done in or outside of the virtual class? If they're using Edgenuity, I've noticed there's a bunch of opinionated questions and the writing responses get points removed if you don't include keywords. Okay. Basically support them when they do their schoolwork. Yeah. Jim, is being impatient part of ADHD? Yes. And Heather, I'm going to stop with you. I'm a recovering alcoholic, and I've always was always told if there's nothing you can do about it at that moment, then it's not that important, and you can try the following day and try again. I love that. That is a beautiful note for us to end on. Julianne says it's okay to celebrate an achievement. I just spit out my coffee laughing. I've never done that. That achievement was just the expectation. I think it's expectation. Okay, well, it's time to start practicing, you know, celebrate a small achievement. Um, And that doesn't mean you're becoming narcissistic. It doesn't mean your ego is mushrooming into an enormous cumulus cloud. It means that you are actually feeding your own, you're pouring water into your own cup of self worth. You have to fill it yourself. You're welcome, Heather. Um, And Cassandra, any disruption in my schedule will cause me to stall, and it can sometimes take weeks or months for me to fully recover and establish a new routine. That can be true for a lot of people with ADHD and also a lot of perfectionists with ADHD. So, I think that because the routine is centering and grounding, and it's how you um, learn to move in the world, but being able to have some things that are unexpected or spontaneous or shifts and adapting to them will help you accept and deal with the imperfections in your life as you go. So I'm going to stop here. Thank you so much for attending today. We will not be meeting next week. No, actually, we will be meeting next week. I'm sorry. I had my schedule messed up. We will be meeting next week. And I will see you then. Um, have a great day and a wonderful weekend. And pat yourself on the back for something that you do that goes pretty well. Okay? Have a good weekend and be kind to yourself today. Look at something you did and said, wow, I tried. It came out okay. Cool. Take care. I'm Dr. Sharon Saline for Attitude Magazine. Please check me out at www.drsharonsaline.com and follow my Facebook at drsharonsaline. I'd love to have you on board. Thank you so much. Bye bye.